Welcome to Strategic Dialogue Podcast. I'm Jalanita Swai, and our today's guest is Lawrence Freeman. Lawrence Freeman is a distinguished researcher and analyst with over 30 years of experience, specializing in the social, political, and economic dynamics of the African continent. His extensive body of work reflects a deep and nuanced understanding of Africa's complex realities. Freeman has also dedicated significant attention to Ethiopia, producing a wealth of insightful commentaries on the country's evolving challenges and opportunities. Renowned for his thoughtful analysis and comprehensive approach, he remains a respected voice in African affairs. Stay tuned. Professor Freeman, welcome to our podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Great. Let me proceed to my first question. So, from your perspective, how would you assess the trajectory of Ethiopia's current agricultural reform agenda? And with that, are the recent state-led initiatives showing signs of structural change?
Yes, I had the opportunity yesterday to visit several farms in Oromia, barley farms and wheat farms. I also had the opportunity to talk to people in the Ministry of Agriculture. And I would say that the progress being made by Ethiopia in the area of agriculture is very significant. The government thinks they've already reached self-sufficiency on wheat in 2022-23. They're projecting they may be able to produce 30 million tons of wheat in 2025. Several things have taken place that have made it effective. One is they're increasing the use of irrigation, which is necessary for modern farming. You can't rely on the rain. So this has increased the number of hectares that are being, where they can use to grow crops. Two is the Ethiopian farming is based on, was based on subsistence farming of 1 to 2 hectares. So now the conception is cluster farming. So they bring groups of farmers together, and they prepare the land together, they plant together, they plow together, they use advanced machinery together, so they're able to collectively have more strength. And this has had, according to the your agricultural department, a huge increase in productivity and in income and production per hectare. So these are some of the things that Ethiopia is doing. And pretty much Ethiopia should not be importing any food from this point on, which is very important because Africa, for no good reason, was importing billions, tens of billions of dollars of food across the whole continent, even though the land is perfectly self-sufficient capability. Yeah. And it was self-sufficient in the early days in the 60s and 70s. But due to neoliberal economic policies, they stopped development. So Ethiopia is playing a very good role on promoting this kind of development. This has been one of the driving points of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. They've given up, I think they've reduced the levies on buying tractors and buying equipment. They reduced taxes. So the whole orientation of promoting agriculture is substantial and hopefully will continue.
Great. So how do you view the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam as a strategic asset for agricultural transformation in Ethiopia? And with that, do you see it meaningfully supporting irrigation and mechanization in the short or long term?
Well, I visited the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for the second time on Saturday. I was there in 2022. Since then, over those 3 years, almost everything's completed. So all turbines have been built, all 13. All waterways are now constructed that brings the water down to the turbine. And now I think they're in the testing phase. I think they have about 6 turbines operating. They're testing the remaining 7 or so. And I think the target for completion is some inauguration maybe in September or earlier. This is a huge plus for Ethiopia. And I mean, you're going to have this very large dam, 74 billion cubic meters of water. And this will essentially push water out to irrigate the entire area, because of course Ethiopia has many river systems.
Yes.
So this will even though the water flow from the dam is not to be used for agriculture, only electricity, hydroelectric, the increase in the water presence and water moisture in the area is going to have an effect on agriculture. And of course, you're going to have more electricity. I think the dam's capability right now is 2,600 megawatts. But it was reaching about 1,800 when I was there. But once you begin to utilize more of the 5,150 available, then you start you create the potential of electrifying rural area. So when poor farmers who are in rural districts begin to have electricity, that changes everything.
Yes.
That was a huge transformation in the United States by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s, the rural electrification program in the center of the United States where people had no electricity. You might know them as the Appalachian hillbillies. And libraries, lights in the homes, none of it existed. And transform the whole center of the United States, which really transformed the whole country.
Yes.
As you get more electricity to the rural areas, you're going to transform productivity, you're going to transform farming, you're going to make every single farmer and worker more productive. I don't think there's been enough recognition by the West, certainly, not by the United States or Europe, on the significance of Ethiopia building the largest hydroelectric dam on the continent. And I believe it's the 17th in the world. This is a real plus, which unfortunately the West ignores or doesn't want to recognize at this point.
So what would you say is the effect on increasing energy production and food security that is Ethiopia is, embarking on?
Well, think about it. You need electricity. Is, in my view, is the most important single ingredient to a successful economy. Infrastructure is essential. So you have to have a platform of infrastructure, which has to include electricity, rail transportation, road transportation, water management. All of this creates a platform of which the entire physical economy rests upon. So the more dense your platform is of infrastructure, the more advanced it is, it raises the productivity of all levels of the economy. For example, I was discussing with people a couple of days ago, not just Ethiopia, but across all of Africa, you lose 30 to 40% of your food rots before it can reach the market. I think in Ethiopia it's 30%.
Oh, wow.
So you didn't know that.
Yeah.
So how do you correct that? You have to have infrastructure that gets the food to the market quickly.
Yeah.
So you have to have modern, fast rail transportation. You have to have what we use in the United States, refrigerated cars to keep the food from spoiling. This is all electricity and roads. So there's no way you're ever going to become an industrialized economy and lift all your people out of poverty without infrastructure. And electricity is the key to infrastructure. So now with the completion of the GERD, and an addition of 5,150 megawatts, Ethiopia will become the second largest country in sub-Saharan Africa producing electricity, only behind South Africa, which actually has a nuclear power plant, which I think all countries should have. Now that is not enough for 130 million people. I know everybody here thinks it's a lot, but from my standpoint as a physical economy, it's very, very significant, but it's not enough. You have to have every part of your society connected to electricity to achieve real independent sovereignty of the development of your people and reaching your potential.
In your analysis, Professor, how might the electricity generated by the GERD reshape rural economies and agribusinesses within Ethiopia and also the wider Horn of Africa region?
Well, we've already discussed part of that, but already Ethiopia is begun the process of regional economic integration because electricity is now being exported to Djibouti, to North Sudan, and to Kenya. And I think before the end of the year, there's going to be transmission to Tanzania. So this is already taking place.
Yes.
The way it works is the electricity from the GERD is transported to the grid of Ethiopia, and then from the grid, this electricity through power lines goes to these neighboring countries. Now that's still a little bit, and now Djibouti wants to increase it, or Kenya wants to increase. So Ethiopia, there's much talk about regional integration, which is with the new African Free Trade Area, but Ethiopia is already practicing it. And the model of Ethiopia's agriculture, that is the success you've had in 5 years, is already something other countries either are or should be emulating because it's a success story. The media in the West, they don't produce any success stories. But Ethiopia is a success story. Now, they'd rather concentrate on the war and other conflicts, but they don't understand the importance of development. Economic development is the key to peace. It's the key to security. It's the key to raising the standard of living and creativity of your population. They don't understand it. I do. And that's why I understand how significant the progress of Ethiopia has been. I've been coming here for 11 years. So I've seen Ethiopia from 2014 to today. And it's very impressive.
Great. How do you assess the regional implications of Ethiopia's agricultural and energy policies for neighboring countries such as Kenya, Sudan, Somalia, and Djibouti, like you just mentioned? Also, especially in the context of transboundary water and food systems.
Well, this is a big issue, is water in Africa. And there's always, people think there's always a danger of water wars. There is lots of water in Africa. The problem is it's not always in the right place. So if we're human beings, we have the power of creativity. We have the power to think and therefore to intervene into nature. We're not arguing with nature. We can change nature. That's my view. So we have to build the appropriate canals, waterways that takes the water from where it is and brings it to where it's needed. And I saw this in some of the farms yesterday where people started building these waterways that would bring the water along to the crop area. Now, the Nile, the longest river in the world, but it's not the most voluminous river in the world. Not even close. So, but you have 10 countries, 10 countries in the Nile Basin, all using Nile water. That's not going to last forever. My view is you're going to have to move towards rapid nuclear-powered desalination. So we get this, take the salt out of the salt water in the Mediterranean, and we have to build the equivalent of a second Nile. Now, while the Nile is not, that's not happening, but it has to happen, this idea of competition over the Nile is not the right way to look at it. You want to look at it in terms of development. Now, the Egyptians do some things that are very useful, including the building a nuclear power plant with Russia, which would only be the second power plant on the continent. But they have adopted, when it comes to the Nile, they've adopted this British imperialist policy that because Queen Victoria gave it to them in 1903, it's their river. But this is artificial. So they always say, well, you have to work out some agreement with us. Well, the first agreement was 1929 between the British, Sudan and Egypt, which are both under British control, so it was really British imperialist. The second agreement in 1959, Egypt and Sudan were no longer under British control, but it was the same exact division of the water. Ethiopia wasn't at either of these two conferences. The water coming from the Blue Nile Basin is not part of any agreement, but the imperialist view, or let's call it the colonialist view of the British and others, is that somehow they have to have guarantees on the water coming from the Blue Nile. Now, in effect, there's 3 different mechanisms built into the GERD to maintain a steady flow of water downstream. 3 different mechanisms. So their countries downstream are actually going to get a more regulated flow of water and actually a more concentrated flow of water because it's being built coming from the dam of the reservoir. So Sudan was being intimidated by Egypt. They should be aligning themselves completely with Ethiopia. They benefit. I've been in Sudan when the Nile's dried up. So they benefit completely. Egypt should give up this colonialist mentality and that never saw the Blue Nile Basin as development. Their view was that Blue Nile Basin would be a, quote, water tank to be used in times of drought to help Egyptian farmers. Now, you probably know there's huge potential in the Blue Nile Basin. There's 3 additional plants that can be built, hydroelectric plants. None of them would be up to the level of 5150 megawatts, but they would all add electricity. So we're not at the end of the process, we're at the beginning of the process. And the idea is think in terms of development. Countries in the Nile working together for development of the nations of the Nile. And I think it's a fait accompli. There's nothing anybody can do to stop the GERD. But it'd be good if we had a more enlightened mentality. And this also goes with the question of port access to the Red Sea, another important waterway. Historical, colonial reasons, the agreement made in 1993 when Eritrea separated. So right now, because of all these arrangements, the port of Assab, which is a natural port for Ethiopia, is in southern Eritrea, and they're not using it. It's just, as far as I know, grass is growing there. But the Eritreans can't see the way to actually see the benefit of working with Ethiopia. Because if Ethiopia has that port with the biggest economy and the fastest growing economy in East Africa, this would benefit the Eritreans. Because the development of a port brings in revenue, brings in commerce, brings in trade, brings in millions of tons of freight passing through. But because of antagonisms and short-sightedness, they can't bring themselves past this point. So this is another issue. But from my standpoint, as a physical economist who thinks in the future, any good leader or economist has to think 20 years into the future. What kind of country, society do you want 20 years from now, 40 years from now for your children? So from that standpoint, it's unnatural that there would be some agreement worked out on Assad because you would be fighting and eliminating poverty and hunger for the whole region. But the problem is people don't think in this enlightened way. Hopefully there'll be some kind of peaceful resolution where we'll get additional port access because Djibouti charges a lot of money for their access. But these are all issues that can be dealt with in negotiations by thoughtful leaders, by governments, and they should be if they're thinking about the benefit of their people, raising the standard of living. Because once you raise the material standard of living, and people are not searching for food and live a dignified life, then you concentrate on the most important thing, which is developing the creative minds of your people. But you can't get there without material existence. So this is my contribution to my analysis of the economies in this region. And I think Ethiopia is situated to play a major role in this.
So, in light of this, do you see viable frameworks for cooperation around the GERD that could support the regional food security and climate resilience? Or are geopolitical tensions, just like you mentioned, likely to overshadow such efforts?
Well, that's the problem, because a lot of what happens here, if you go back in the history of this region, which you know, I'm sure better than I mean, Ethiopia is the only country that was not conquered. And I like the museum. I just saw it a few days ago. You have downtown that the Prime Minister built, celebrating Adwa. By the way, my suggestion is on whatever day they inaugurate the dam, that they add this as a national holiday, GERD Day, because it can unify the country. But this is, unfortunately, you have this whole history, which involves British colonialism in Somalia, the Italians, the various ways countries were manipulated. I think Eritrea, Somalia and Somaliland were each independent about 5 or 6 days before they formed the nation. And Somaliland has been functioning almost independently for 30 years or more. All this history of colonialism and the legacy of antagonism. This prevents us from doing what is obvious to me we should be doing. Regional economic development. I mean, Ethiopia, like all African countries, is using a tiny fraction of the arable land. I mean, in other words, there's a potential for land and there's the actual use of arable land. And then even a tinier fraction is used for irrigation. Now, Ethiopia just started to practice irrigation, which is excellent. This same conception can be used in all the countries in Africa. And we don't have to have, and this is one of my missions, is to end poverty and hunger in Africa. Now, you have a lot of people still living in poverty.
Yeah.
You have very low per capita income. It's very uneven. This has to change. People cannot live on 5,000 to 6,000, 8,000 birr a month. That's not acceptable. But you can't do that unless you're producing more physical wealth and putting more people to work. There's a very big emphasis in the transformation plan, the homegrown economic reform of the Prime Minister, on manufacturing. So you don't have Africa has been prevented from ever producing real manufacturing industry. Less than 3% of total manufactured goods in the world come from the continent of Africa. And now you're working on light industry, the leather industry, various other forms of adding value to your agricultural products, to coffee, which is your biggest export. So this concentration on manufacturing, I visited 3 garment centers. Some of the material produced is excellent. So the building up of manufacturing, which is the most important part of your economy next to infrastructure, is another essential. The issue is clear. No one else has addressed it in Ethiopia the way I do. And I proposed this after the war, and they set up the Dialogue Commission. The fundamental issue, the Constitution has to be changed. Everybody knows that. But you have to get to that point. You have to have a robust, maybe contentious discussion, debate, dialogue with the people of Ethiopia. You have to attack the notion of national ethnic identity. Not ethnic culture, but ethnic identity. What has to be reinforced is that Ethiopia is a nation state, and that people in Ethiopia are citizens of a nation state, not members of a national ethnicity. So ethnic nationalism is your enemy. And it's in the minds of people over many decades. You have to take it on at its root, that there's no congruence between ethnic identity, nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and citizenship. There's not at all. They're not equal. We're not asking people to give up their history, because their history is very rich, but you're members of a nation. And I'm disappointed that no one has taken up this issue in the way I'm discussing it now, but I believe this is what has to be done for Ethiopia to reach its full potential.
I think that's such a profound idea. So how should international partners engage with Ethiopia's dual push for food self-sufficiency and energy leadership, and given the sensitivity surrounding GERD and regional politics?
Well, the problem is that the, quote, international community doesn't understand anything about economic development, and not much about Ethiopia. As I said, I'm probably the expert as an American. The West, since the death of John F. Kennedy, has had no interest in development. When I say development, I mean raising the material standard of living of people. And therefore you have all these NGOs, you have all these international organizations, some of which the U.S. is dismantling. But they don't focus on questions that really would change the society. For example, my argument with all the NGOs is if you want to improve life, you want to bring democracy, you want to bring good governance, then you have to put electricity at the top of your list. A lot of electricity people don't develop. So there's not going to be any, quote, good governance. You're going to have what, good governance over poverty? what is the point of that? So there's got to be a change in the thinking of the West, as I mentioned to you earlier. All you have to do is look at certain indications and you get the whole dynamic clear. Why hasn't the United States, in particular, 3 different presidents during the time of the building of the GERD, or Western leaders, why haven't they complimented Ethiopia on the GERD? The largest hydroelectric dam built without money from the World Bank or IMF. That's a success. Why haven't they come? Why haven't presidents come here like I have and gotten on that small Cessna plane and flown out to the GERD and looked at it? That's your problem. So the West is ideologically deficient and prejudicial against development. So they're not good partners right now. Now that is going to change because I've been writing recently a lot on China and the U.S. And the, quote, rules-based order, the name of Western leadership, is collapsing. They're in a crisis because China is outproducing the United States in every major category of economics: aluminum, steel, shipbuilding, electricity, nuclear power. And they don't know what to do because the United States is contracting its manufacturing base. We're a consumer society in the United States. 70% of the gross domestic product in the United States comes from consumer spending. It's not driven by manufacturing. We have no manufacturing, and China's overtaken us. China didn't cause our problem, we caused the problem. The ideology of the West is now coming home to destroy it. And China is growing, the BRICS are growing, which Ethiopia is now one of the 3 African countries in the BRICS. A whole non-aligned movement, or now sometimes we call it the Global South. All of this will come together with the potential of forming a new set of political economic relations among nations, built on a new paradigm of economic development and growth. That's what's possible. Now, hopefully we have enough enlightened leaders in Africa, Latin America, and Asia who will do what I'm saying, which is come together for a new paradigm. The West cannot stop it except bringing us into war, which is why the danger of Ukraine war could bring us into conflict with Russia. There's also a group of insane think tanks in the United States who salivate every day preparing to that the United States has to defend Taiwan in a war in 2027, which they say China's going to try to invade Taiwan, so we have to be ready. This is geopolitical stupidity based on the zero-sum game that the world is fixed, and the only thing important is who's the #1 hegemon. And everyone else has to be below you. And that's been broken. And that's the big danger. So I don't know what the West is going to... At some point, they're going to have to change. At some point, they may recognize what they have to do. What they should do in Africa is they should be giving long-term, low-interest credit for infrastructure. Help Africa build more hydroelectric plants. Help them build nuclear power plants. You don't have to give them the money, although you could, but you give them a long-term loan, 15 years, 2 to 3% interest rate. That's how long it takes to get the profitability. Because infrastructure in and of itself may not make money, but it makes money by raising the profitability of the whole economy. So if we had any brains and we were intelligent, what we would do is we would unite with China, which would break all the norms, and we would say between the 2 great economic superpowers, we will together help assist African nations to build the infrastructure necessary to eliminate electricity, to build electricity, to eliminate poverty and hunger. I proposed this in the United States 15 years ago. 1 or 2 people were interested. But nevertheless, it's the right thing to do. That is the best way for the West to work with Africa. Not tell them what to do, but assist them in those critical areas that will be transformational.
I think it would be interesting to see how this turns out.
Yes, well, that's what I'm working for.
Great. From a regional integration lens, what role could Ethiopia's emerging industrial base, especially agro-processing and light manufacturing, play in reshaping trade and economic interdependence in the Horn of Africa?
Well, think about it. I mean, right now, the major export of Ethiopia is coffee. There is added value that can be given to coffee. I think I mentioned earlier that Ethiopia assessed that they're self-sufficient in wheat. That means that now they can start exporting wheat for foreign exchange. You need foreign exchange. You've wasted, everybody in Africa has wasted foreign exchange by buying agricultural products. So you take your precious foreign exchange, which you don't really have any of, and you're sending it off to the West to import food. As I think I mentioned, this $40 billion bill that Africa as a whole has to be eliminated. And I think Ethiopia is close to doing that. And then you take the areas where you have these strengths, like for example, Ethiopia has 165 million animal stock. That's huge, that's largest in Africa, but it's large overall. So think about, that's the leather industry. So now again, this is light manufacturing. Does Ethiopia have plans to build steel plants? I think they do. And I think AMG already has somewhat of a steel plant. I'm going to try to see it in Adama tomorrow. But you need national industries like steel, aluminum, cement, big industries that enable you not to have to buy from other countries at their controlled terms of trade. The West always has controlled terms of trade. So rather than wasting your foreign exchange at their prices, you produce it yourself. And then where you can produce a surplus, like coffee and other items you're going to do, then that increases your ability to bring in more revenue. Now I know tourism is a big part. There's tourism, there's 5 areas of the reform, not necessarily priority. But my priority would be manufacturing, agriculture, mining, tourism, digital, IT. I don't know what name they use these days. Those are the areas that the reform plan and the Prime Minister are putting a focus on. However, they're not all equal. Like right now, you have 40% of your GDP is service. So that means service industry and tourism. That's not good. You want to have a lower percentage of your GDP because service and tourism brings in revenue, doesn't produce wealth. As much as you want it to, it doesn't. It's nice, but it doesn't produce wealth. So you have to have a greater emphasis on your manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. Right? Now, I understand gold has now become a big revenue source in Ethiopia. But you have to have your priorities straight from a physical economy. So there's a problem with last time, many years ago, I looked at the Kenyan economy. And 50% of the economy was tourism and service. That's not going to work. You can't feed people that way. I mean, people go to a restaurant and they pay their money and they get food, but you haven't produced anything. But that's considered part of your GDP. So I want to make sure we have a focus on the industrial side. And I think there is, from what I can tell in my discussion since I got here, there is that conception. I've been discussing with some of the leaders of your country, Alexander Hamilton from the United States. He was the first Secretary-Treasurer under George Washington. He is the actual individual who built the U.S. economy, not this Adam Smith free trade guy. And Hamilton's big fight with the early founding fathers against Jefferson and other people, they wanted to keep the colonies once we became a republic, agrarian. And that's what and they would have focused on states' rights and slavery. Hamilton said, no, we have to rapidly transform through infrastructure manufacturing as rapidly as we can to liberate ourselves from being controlled by the British Empire. And that's the great buildup. It was called the American system of political economy. All great presidents, of course, George Washington followed it, John Quincy Adams, McKinley, then you had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then John Kennedy in his short lifespan. That was it. For the last 60 years, we have nobody who understands this as a leader in the United States. Trump, I was hoping would move in this direction, and he picked up one part of it, which is tariffs, but that's not going to work by the way he's conducting it. So he's a disappointment to me because he's not going with this policy. He still thinks money is the most important thing. Money is not the most important thing. Credit for production. Credit means you can build something in the future by giving someone a 15-year credit lease. To build what? To build physical wealth. And that's what we need. And I've been to I've worked with half a dozen countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, others, Sudan for a long time. They've never grasped this conception of economic, physical wealth as the way to move the country forward. I think Ethiopia has an understanding of this. I don't know, didn't know it was Hamiltonian, but I've been telling them this is the Hamiltonian approach. And I've always liked Ethiopia. And I've studied Ethiopia since I started in 2010, when I was asked to look by a foreign country to write a report on Ethiopia. So as a consultant, as an economic analyst, what I call myself a physical economist, I see Ethiopia making progress. Now many of the diaspora in the United States and other people, they attack me all the time, but they don't even look at the progress Ethiopia is making. Of course there's problems, but there is progress. Maybe the progress isn't going fast enough, maybe it isn't covering everything, and we want to push that as far as we can, but there is progress, and that is the basis for optimism.
Moving to my final question. Ethiopia is also investing heavily in urban infrastructure and industrial parks. So how do you assess the role of urban development in facilitating structural transformation, labor mobility, and regional economic competitiveness?
Well, one of the things I did when I was here is I got a tour by the mayor's office of Addis Ababa. And I've watched Addis Ababa change since 2014. It's almost not recognizable, except for the traffic. But I looked at some of the policies they have. They're clearing out these polluted rivers. They're putting in new walkways. This whole area around the Adwa Museum. These, tree planting, very important tree planting. I have my disagreements with some aspects of the environmentalist movement. But trees are the single best thing you can do to improve the environment. I also happen to be a pretty avid hiker. So I hike 20 miles a week, 2 days, 10 miles each day. And then I also, what's called, I don't know if people know the term, backpacking, which is I put on a backpack, food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and I go off into the mountains by myself, and I do another 50 to 100 miles. I love trees. So trees are great because trees absorb the CO2, which they love as their food, and they breed O2. And the more photosynthesis you have occurring on the leaves, you actually change the climate through transpiration, how much water comes up and how much water comes down. So if you want to change the desert, plant trees. If you want it, and I know you guys have one of the most aggressive policies. I think I've heard you've so far planted 40 billion seedlings, and you have another 10 billion to go. This is very positive. And I also saw that the people who were taken out of the less developed areas of housing along the waterways, they haven't been thrown out or eliminated, as many of the detractors of Ethiopia tell me. They're just being destroyed, blah, blah, blah. They're being resettled. And I went out to one of the resettlement plants. Now they still have a long way to go, these resettlement places, but they're given housing, they're given food, they're building small bakeries there and other small manufacturing parts. This is positive. So I think if you look at the changes in Addis and the changes that I've seen in the farming in Oromia and the manufacturing, again, this is slow, not enough, because you have 130 million people. You have to employ them all, which is hard to do. You have to give them good paying jobs, which is hard to do. But this is the direction that I see Ethiopia going. There's a lot of detractors as you probably know, of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. We've never talked, but I follow what he's doing carefully. I don't get involved in analyzing every political nuance of what governments do. I look at what the substantial result of the policies are, and it's palatable what we're seeing in Ethiopia. So that should be encouraged. That should be supported. We should not overlook what still has to be done, and criticisms are fine if they're made in good faith to actually move the country forward. I've been involved in politics since I was 17, and I'm going to be 74 tomorrow.
Wow.
So for me, it's been over half a century. And I participate in all kinds of politics. I don't mind opposition politics. I'm the opposition sometimes. The question is, does your opposition have a better policy? So all these critics, and believe me, the diaspora is rich with criticism, but what is the policy? What are you proposing that would improve it? Does FANO have a policy for development of Ethiopia? I've not seen it. Does OLA have a policy? So you can't, to just be criticized for the sake of being negative, how are you helping anything? How are you helping anybody? We got to get this guy out, he's no good. Okay, fine. Run in the next election. Win the people over by a better policy. Educate them with a better policy, if you have one. If you don't have one, keep your mouth quiet and let us move on with economic development. So this is, I think Ethiopia, if you look at the changes in Addis, you look at the changes in farming, you look at the changes in industry, and of course, my great love, the Grand Ethiopian Dam, this is something that we can use not only to change Ethiopia, but this could become a template or a model, or at least a source of optimism for the rest of Africa, because we have massive poverty in Africa. 450 million people live in poverty. 600 million people have no electricity. This is criminal. It is unacceptable. And I don't know how many years I got left of fighting, but what my fight is to raise the level of economic wealth in Africa to eliminate poverty and hunger. And using Hamiltonian methods and other things I know, this could be done in one generation if we had the willpower and the leadership to do it.
Professor Lawrence, we've had a very insightful discussion. You have enlightened us, and thank you once again for coming on our podcast.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. Maybe we'll do it again someday.
We would love that. Thank you again.